Okay, so welcome again to today's webinar, Good for the Soil, Good for the Farmer, presented by Dr. Matthew Sanderson. This program is supported through the United States Department of Agricultural Transition to Organic Partnership Program, or TOPP. TOPP is a program of the USDA Organic Transition Initiative and is administered by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services National Organic Program. And you can find more information regarding TOPP via a link in the chat that I will add pretty soon. Today's webinar is in partnership with the Nebraska Sustainable Agricultural Society. NSAS is a nonprofit grassroots membership organization initiated over 40 years ago by farmer members. The society has grown into a dynamic organization with members from all across Nebraska promoting agriculture and food systems that build healthy land, people, communities, and quality of life for present and future generations. NSAS welcomes farmers and non-farmers alike. So now I'm going to turn it over to Audrey, the NSAS program coordinator, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Allison, and welcome to all of you. Nice to see your faces or your pictures here. Glad you could take time to join us. So yes, I am the program manager at NSAS, Nebraska Sustainable Ag Society. I first heard about Dr. Sanderson when a friend of mine heard him speak to the Kansas Black Farmers Association. And my friend Edgar said, you wouldn't believe what he's learned. You wouldn't believe about his research. So I quickly tried to get him to come to our conference and do all these sorts of things. But when Allison had this opportunity for him to speak about the research he's done, I'm like, yes, we need to do this. So Dr. Sanderson is a professor of sociology, anthropology, and social work at K-State. He's also done research around Ogallala with the aquifer there. And I think you're going to be delighted to see how he was surprised by his research. So Dr. Sanderson, it's up to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me go ahead and pull up the slides here, and then, oh wait, I got to share screen here. Okay. Thank you very much for having me today. Thanks to Allison and the Grain Place Foundation and Audrey and the Nebraska Sustainable Ag Society. It really is a privilege to be with you all today to share a little bit about some of the research that I've been carrying out in Kansas mainly. It is starting to broaden out a little bit, but this research we'll talk about today is from Kansas. And the opening slide, I think, is a good place to start. This photo I took down on the way to meet with some of the farmers that we'll talk about here in this research. And there are cloudy spots in some of this talk, but there is a rainbow. You can see there is a rainbow, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that metaphor here in a second. I also want to mention that so the title of the talk is a little different here from the one that was given. The title is based on the paper that was published in Journal of Rural Studies recently called Good for the Soil, Good for the Farmer, and it did have a question mark in it. We know, so I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as well. All right, so a couple opening thoughts and some caveats just to get started. As Audrey mentioned, I'm a sociologist, I'm a social scientist. These are caveats. I am not a farmer. I am not an agronomist. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm not a plant pathologist, you know, on and on and on. I'm a sociologist. So I study the human dimensions, human aspects of population environment change and relationships. And much of my research, of course, in that area is on themes of sustainability and resilience. This research I'm going to talk about today, I'd never set out to study something called regenerative agriculture. I do a lot of work with farmers and ranchers throughout the Great Plains and abroad. But this research really is sort of a byproduct of research that I was doing on water depletion and water use, water conservation over the Ogallala Aquifer. And through the course of doing that research over 8 to 10 years, I started hearing about regenerative agriculture more and more and more. And gradually, this research that I'll talk about today emerged really out of some of the questions that were raised as I was doing work on water use, water depletion, water conservation over the aquifer, over the Ogallala High Plains aquifer. So it's important you have a little sense of the context of why I got it, of how I got into this research and sort of who I am. And finally, I make no claim to originality on much of what I'll talk about here today. I hope to be useful to the conversation around sustainability, resilience, regenerative, organic agriculture, and so on. But I expect, especially with this group, that a good amount of what I'll say here today, you'll know something about. I hope to add a little bit of value from the research, maybe provide a few insights into this process of transition into regenerative ag that we studied. So the roadmap looks like this. I'll provide a little bit of context for regenerative agriculture, sort of what's happening, how did we get here? I'll try to answer the question of what exactly is regenerative agriculture very briefly, but at least acknowledging some differences and similarities in the definitions of this thing or this practice or set of principles. I'll talk then about the research, which is about transitioning to regenerative agriculture. Why do we see these transitions? And importantly, how are these transitions experienced by the folks going through them? And then a few concluding thoughts and questions. So that will be the order we'll step through today. To start, I think it's important to start with a little etymology, a little bit of the meaning of these words, and we're going to come back to this toward the end. But the word is health, and health comes from the Indo-European root hal, which is also the same root for heal, whole, and holy. And so to be healthy in this language is to be whole, and to heal something is to make whole, integrate, synthesize, bring together again, put back together what has been taken apart. So we're going to talk, you'll see a theme that comes out of this research is really about health. It's about soil health, but it's also about health beyond even the ecology. It's about the health of humans and human communities writ large, in the largest, most inclusive sense of that word, community. Okay, so a little bit on the context, and again, this is where many of us here will have a sense that of many of these trends, is to put this work into some context, right? So we have, as of course, at this moment in time, an urgent need for resilience. I just read this morning that 2023, the summer of 2023, last summer, was the warmest summer for the Northern Hemisphere in 2,000 years, according to tree ring data. Okay, so we have an urgent need for resilience amidst this type of change. We have a changing climate. We have freshwater loss and degradation primarily. We have soil loss through erosion. We have biodiversity loss, which is the loss of life itself and its diversity. We have farm consolidation. We have rural population decline throughout most of the country, and we have rising rural suicide rates. And to the extent that now the most risky occupation in the state of Kansas is farmer. They're at the highest risks of suicides. It's like 2 to 3 times the level even of our veterans. So it's not a rosy picture. This is the cloudy part of that opening slide. But how we feed ourselves, right, is a vital part of this context. It's both part of the problem, and potentially part of the solution. And so, the argument is that we need new models of healing, of health, of how to be more whole. And these new models really require new stories that we can put into practice. These are the premises I work from. As a sociologist, uh, the stories we tell about ourselves, the narratives we tell ourselves are extremely important for understanding human behavior, because human behavior is guided by stories. We see through the stories the language we use, and in doing that, we build the world out of these stories and these words and this language that we use. So as a sociologist, right, if we have problems related to agriculture or problems of agriculture, then we have to ask ourselves, what stories are we telling ourselves? What stories are we acting out with agriculture? And I'm going to go into this in some detail. This is the sort of context for this research, right? Okay, so a little bit about regenerative agriculture, just at broad scale, high level, right? It's getting significant attention from producers, from retailers, researchers, consumers, policymakers, the media. It seems to be the buzzword of the moment. Um, Interest spans the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. It's a hot topic right now, okay? But what exactly is it? Well, there is no one, of course, legal regulatory definition of this thing, and there is no one common accepted definition of this thing. Making matters more complicated, there are other terms that are used synonymously or adjacently with regenerative ag. There are folks that call this thing agroecological farming, alternative ag, biodynamic agriculture, carbon farming, nature inclusive farming, conservation agriculture, green agriculture, regenerative organic, sustainable. I mean, I just stopped the list because it's a very long list and it could go on for a very long slide. The point here is that what we're talking about here is a contested area. And it's important to recognize that when you set out to study something, you have to be able to define the object of study. This is something different from what we're used to studying and trying to understand. The depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer, right? We know we have where water is to a large extent. We know, because we have monitoring, what the water levels are. We have flow meters and so on. We can define the problem spatially and temporally. Regenerative ag starts with the question about what is it? And I want to acknowledge just today, I'm not going to enter into these. We can have the discussion certainly, but I just want to acknowledge this is part of a bunch of contested different ideas about how to farm, basically. Okay. Another aspect of this question of regenerative agriculture is it a set of processes or outcomes, right? So some focus on means, where we're focusing here on the processes, practices, and principles of regenerative ag. So for example, regenerative ag from this perspective is based on principles that work with nature in a whole systems approach. And these folks tend to be more open-minded about the outcomes of their work, right? On the other hand, there are folks that focus on outcomes or the ends, right? And these folks tend to be open-minded about how we get to these outcomes. For example, these are quotations that are used commonly to try to define regenerative agriculture. The ends-focused folks are about any and all forms of agricultural practice that actively restore soil quality, biodiversity, ecosystems health, water quality, while producing sufficient food of high nutritional quality, right? So they're open-minded about the actual practices. They're focused on the outcomes, right? What do these things actually do for the land, the water, the soil, people, so on, right? There is no agreement on if regenerative agriculture is a process-based thing or an outcome-focused things. It's a big tent at this point. It goes by many names, and it includes folks with process orientations and folks with outcome orientations. That said, there does seem to be emerging agreement on 5 principles or practices and 1 outcome. Okay. And as many of us know, and these are not in order of any priority, but there are 5 principles or practices that are generally accepted in this definition of regenerative agriculture. Limit soil disturbance through limited tillage, no tillage, keep the armor, cover on the soil surface, cover crops, build diversity into the system everywhere you can, keep living roots in the soil as long as you can throughout the year, and integrate livestock where and if possible. Those are generally seen as the 5. There are more, there are less in some operations and some definitions, but though there is agreement, generally speaking, around those principles. It's important to recognize here that these are not new, that regenerative agriculture is a new phrase, but it actually mimics some indigenous principles and practices that date back centuries on this very land, right? So processes, right? Principles, the practices, these are commonly accepted principles and practices associated with the process of regenerative agriculture. But as I said, regenerative agriculture is a set of processes, principles, practices. If it does have a shared outcome among all the different types or definitions, words, it's probably soil health, right? And so most of the folks we visit with are concerned or focused on somehow improving soil health, the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem, right? And here the perspective, of course, is that soil is not an inert medium to grow a plant, but that it's dynamic, it's life-giving, it's alive. And I'm not going to go through all these points here. I'm assuming most of us are familiar with these, but the basic idea is that more organic matter means healthier soil in general speaking, in general terms, and that you have more minerals and nutrients to feed plants. It has more bacteria and fungi that it makes more resilient to diseases and pests. It aggregates or binds together to prevent erosion and runoff. Therefore, it holds more water, making it more resilient to dry periods and drought. Soil health seems to be a key outcome that unites the diversity of people that are involved in this activity, and some would call a movement, okay? But I'm going to move through here. So we know that in looking at the research on regenerative agriculture, right, most of the research on regenerative agriculture focuses on the ecological benefits, the agronomic benefits, right? And there is emerging and quite a substantial bit of evidence that shows that it does reduce erosion rates, it does improve aggregation and structure of the soil, it does enhance water capacity, it does support biodiversity, it does reduce compaction, and pest management is improved, and so is water quality. These are the things that come out of reviews of scholarly research looking at the ecological benefits of these practices, processes, and principles. But I'm a sociologist, so I am asking a slightly related question about, it seems to be good for the soil. Is it good for the farmer too? And surprisingly, there is not much research on this question. So we set out to do a pilot study. And again, I had no grand ambitions with this study. I'm a researcher, so I had questions, and it emerged out of the other work I was doing. And so we started together. I want to acknowledge my co-author and graduate student, Jacob Miller, who helped immensely with this research. We started looking at what we call transitions to regenerative agriculture, right? Lots of people are asking about how to promote the transition to regenerative agriculture, and that usually boils down to questions of how do we get these folks to adopt certain practices, right? But transitioning from conventional practices is difficult. Someone called them industrial practices. Well, it's difficult. It's not just a matter of dropping one thing and doing another. I mean, my phone an email is full a lot of weeks with questions of how do we get these farmers to do what they should be doing? You know, these kinds of questions. But as a social scientist, you know, I emphasize and very interested in the human aspects of this question, and that means I'm interested in culture. I'm interested in the way that people see the world around them and interpret the world around them. And farmers and ranchers are people, and they're doing this. They're looking around, they're seeing through their language, they're looking through the stories that they tell themselves about who they are and what they're doing and where they are. And we need to remember along those lines that the word agriculture has culture in it, that agriculture is a culture. It's a holistic way of looking and seeing and being in the world. It's a set of norms, values, and beliefs that people use to make sense of what they're doing and their lives and their identities. Okay, and so agriculture provides an identity. It provides a sense of self. It prescribes a way of good farming and what it means to be a good farmer. It's, again, a set of norms and values, beliefs that we act out. It's a set of stories that we're telling and imposing upon ourselves, really. It's a way of seeing the world, agriculture, and your place in it. And so when we're asking about how or why or when people transition from conventional industrial practices to regenerative practices, right, we're really talking about a worldview shift. A paradigm shift, a shift in the way that a person sees themselves in relation to other farmers and their own land, right? And so we explore, right, why do farmers transition to regenerative ag, and how do they experience this transition? Again, it seems to be regenerative, it seems to be good for the soil based on the evidence, but is it also good for the farmers themselves? These were the questions that we went to the field and tried to learn more about. So a little bit about the data and methods, and talk more about this if you'd like, but we conducted a set of interviews. These were in-person interviews and visits with 51 farmers in Kansas at 2 different times, June to August 2021, January to February 2022. And bottom line, we asked them questions, you know, we observed them, we worked with them in the field, we visited with them, we talked with them over an extended period of time, and we tried to get farmers along a continuum so we could look at variation in transitions, right? So we took the 5 agreed regenerative agricultural principles, and we were able to place farmers along a continuum by how many of these principles they were practicing at the time of the interview. And it's a simple, but turns out fairly effective way of sorting people in to a continuum based on how deep or shallow they are into the transition into regenerative agriculture. So people that were practicing, that were using just one of these practices, maybe cover crops or no-till, you know, they're earlier in the transition or not as deep as people obviously practicing or implementing all 5, right? And so we have a fairly good balance here from 1 to 5. So we have variation in, we think, how people are experiencing these transitions. Okay, so first question was, why do people transition to regenerative ag at all? How did that journey start? And we find that there is no one variable, no one cause, no one factor. And so it's something of a fallacy to talk about a transition to regenerative agriculture. there are multiple types of transitions to this thing called regenerative agriculture. Every story really is unique. But if there is a theme about, why folks transition, it's that generally these folks reach some kind of a breaking point or crisis in their life or on their operation or both. And that tended to be financial, social, emotional. There was a break. And so I'm going to show you some direct quotations now. And these are all pseudonyms, fake names, so that these folks are identities are protected. So this is John, who's 12 years into the transition to regenerative agriculture. And John was using 4 of the 5 practices on his operation. And he talks about this theme, right? So every farmer I talk to comes from a different angle, whether it's financial, spiritual, emotional, a divorce. Every shape and form of farmers that have went through hell and back have come to this regenerative ag movement because it creates a better life, right? So this John captures broadly how this transition starts or why. Among these breaking points or crises were financial motivations, right? So here's Jackson, who's 10 years in and implements all 5 practices on his operation. And he is helping now work with others to help them transition as well. He talks about the financial motivation to transition. He says, several farmers in my area almost lost their farms because they couldn't get a line of credit because they're so highly leveraged. So they felt like they had to use cover crops to change. This was a typical sort of quotation about, sort of the financial reasons why folks start to transition. And it usually comes out of some sort of crisis breaking point, often financial, right? But others were motivated for environmental reasons. Frank, right, described this motivation. He says, you can walk outside in the morning and smell chemicals. When your eyes are watering and you see the smell, you see that smell and smell that stuff for 10 minutes, I can't help but think that it's doing something to you. Okay. Doug, severe allergic reaction, right? So we voted not to go that route. I would have a metallic taste in my mouth for a month after, and this isn't even handling the stuff. It's simply the smell of it. And I go, you know what? I want to live another 20 or 30 years. I don't want to go down this road. Okay. So these were emblematic of the environmental sorts of reasons that we heard people use as reasons to get into regenerative agriculture, right? Okay, but so regardless of the motivation for getting in, right, or the trigger for getting in, these transitions were described as worldview changing. The process of going into regenerative ag changes how people see and think and act is a key finding. Okay, so the most common theme we find here is that folks, of course, contrast their transition into regenerative ag with what they call industrial or conventional agricultural methods. They also describe this as a way from moving away from kind of a productivist ideal of the good farmer, that more production, more output, more yield is the goal, to something different in the regenerative ag movement. They talk about it in terms of moving away from using all available tools, chemical inputs, and industrial methods to try to just maximize production and output, again, to something different. And so when you talk with them about what it is they're doing and why they're making changes, they often start with these comparisons against the industrial conventional model. So here's a guy we're calling Boyne, who's in it with 4 practices and has been transitioning for a long time in the process, 16 years in, contrasting himself with his neighbor who continually employs conventional industrial practices. And he expresses some sympathy and regret here. He, the neighbor, right, just has to kill and control for tidiness. He carries everything with him. Everything is so stressful. He doesn't get enjoyment out of what he does, right? These are the sorts of comparisons we see people making in this transition. Another one, Arnold, right? contrasts himself with his father-in-law who employs those methods as well. My father-in-law worked the soil 8 times. He plowed it, disked it, and field cultivated it over and over to look perfect. I'd have 15% better yields every year with my minimum tillage, and my input costs were significantly less, but all he could hear in his head was the coffee shop crowd bragging about how clean his fields were. Again, good farming is a way of seeing the world. We're acting out stories, right, about what it means to be a good farmer and what it means to conduct good farming. So the shifts start with these comparisons, and then we start to hear folks go a little bit deeper generally, okay? At this point, I want to emphasize that we found that these transitions take time. And it's important to acknowledge this and realistically that going deeper into regenerative agriculture can be better for the soil, and it can be harder on the farmer. And I want to talk about that, right? So here's Tyler, right? When chemistry has killed the biology, to redevelop the soil biology takes time. He says, we heard this a lot. We heard this a lot, right? So the worldview often starts to change before the soil changes. In other words, it's changing the way that one sees the world happens, but the soil health, right, takes time to rebuild, and that friction in that process, that lag, is a source of anxiety. It's a source of frustration. It's where we lose some people in the process. Okay, we think, right? So here's Aldrich describing that, right? My soil wasn't where I was mentally. Its health wasn't exactly where I wanted it to be, even though I knew I could get there. It just takes time. You can't change your soil in 1 year. In 3 years, it's a slow building process. And the first years are the hardest, right? We find that in year 3, there tends to be an inflection point. People go one of 2 directions. They either stay in it and go deeper, or we lose folks around year 3. There's variation, but around year 3, this was a theme among the data, right? Max describes this, right? He's 5 years in. Landlords will dump you and your neighbor will come outbid you tomorrow. You can find a regenerative landowner that doesn't care if he breaks even for a couple years. There are guys out there, but good luck finding them around here, right? Bill talks about this point as well. He's 3 years in, right at the cusp, right? I can't afford 3 years of zero income. There's no way the banker's going to let me do that. The economics of it is that I have to be profitable making money farming now. If I go broke, somebody else will come farm my ground and they'll farm it however they see fit. Who knows what they'll do, right? And remember at this time, right, these folks are not seeing much recovery during those years 1 to 2, and they're hearing all the coffee shop banner, right? All the chatter. They're trying to do something different, tell a different story, live out a different story, but the culture is still very much a conventional culture. So this is a hard process, and year 3 we found seems to bring these processes to a head, and it's due to that lag between the worldview shift and the time for soil health to recover, right? This is the working hypothesis. But those that persevered through year 3, we found these folks we called steeled, right? They were sort of hardened to the coffee shop crowd, and they were more convinced of the benefits for their soil, but also for themselves, right? And so we found kind of a new form of independence emerged, was another theme, a changing identity, a different sense of self, purpose, different idea of a good farmer. Ryan, for example, used this idea of talking about industrial agriculture. He said it made him a government contractor, which he used pejoratively, right? Phil, if it wasn't for government payments, we wouldn't have made anything, right? Baltus talks about this as well. Government subsidies are propping up bad practices, right? And Lawton, who's 4 years in, just past that cusp, right? If you're determined to stick it out for a couple years, You start to see that I don't need the government to tell me what I can and can't grow. I can do this because I'm making money and not in the form of subsidy checks. So we did find after that year 3, this sort of talk came up. This new form of independence was a theme that come up for people that had stuck it out, right? At the same time, we found, interestingly, what we call a new form of dependence, not on government subsidies, but on nature, on the environment, on the ecology around them. There was an emerging identity of farming as working with nature, of being part of a living system, of being dependent on this living, functioning system that they're working with, not against. That is a common theme we heard after year 3, especially. Many, of course, use language from the Christian Bible to express these sentiments, right? So here's Henry. I very much view myself as a part of nature. And I want to live my life in contrast to the tradition I was raised in, where you have dominion over nature, where you fight nature, right? Mason, I don't think in terms of dominion anymore, and I don't see nature and soil as things to be conquered. I see us a part of creation as opposed to being separate from it and not necessarily above it. Right. So while we heard folks talking about independence more, a new form of independence, mainly from government subsidies and so on, we also found this new form of dependence on the ecosystems around them. Right. Then even beyond that, we found, and at deeper levels, right, we found people that were more able to see the whole and their part in it. See, they saw themselves as a part of the ecosystem, not apart from these ecosystems. So they often talked about this as connections or as being a whole systems approach, right? Or living within whole systems, right? So here's Jeremiah. I use a holistic approach to farming. You're not looking at bushels for one crop, looking at how all these things fit together in a healthy way. There's that word. The other approach has been to the detriment of the farmer and to the organisms in the soil. Without seeing agriculture as a functioning whole system, we have totally diminished people, soil, and the environment. These are the sorts of things we see with people that have made it through that transition and are thinking at really deep levels about what it is they're actually a part of and what they're doing. And out of this comes new ways of seeing themselves and the world around them. So here's John, who expresses these new views of self and purpose even, right? John's 12 years in and is practicing 4 of those 5 principles, right? He says, your whole mindset changes. There's life here and success, not the failure that comes with, I can't put food on my family without getting more debt. You will treat your family differently. If you interact with conventional farmers every day, you know that they don't have as much of a spring in their step. And then you see the next guy who has incorporated these regenerative things. You see it in their eyes. They look excited. They have a little more spring in their step, and they're more excited about life because there's hope. And we heard these sorts of things. John's not unique, about people that had been in it for a while, that had made it through the fire, the early on fire, and the 3-year and they're deep into it. They're seeing self and purpose differently. And so we started to see the theme of coming back to life as a part of this work. And folks were actually drawing contrasts between death and life as they transition from conventional to regenerative ag practices, right? So here's Jackson, right? 10 years in. Before I changed my farm and started caring about my soil and thinking about the soil as an ecosystem, it was a very depressing life. Every day, I'd wake up deciding what I was going to kill next, whether that was a pest or a weed. It was a life revolved around death. But when I completely changed the outlook of my life, when I started trying to grow things and bring life to my farm, it gave me a positive attitude. It's less draining to work around life instead of death every day. It's a very powerful statement, and it's not unique. Folks talked about this death and life contrast as a part of the process. He's not alone. Okay. So trying to sort of wrap this up, right? Regenerative ag seems to be good for the soils and ecosystems, and more folks around us are looking at regenerative agriculture for a variety of reasons, right? We find that these transitions into regenerative are diverse. The process can be very challenging, both agronomically, but also socially, culturally, emotionally, financially. For those, though, that make it through, it seems to be worldview changing and life course shifting, right? So why regenerative agriculture? One argument is that it helps perhaps heal and make whole and put back together what has been taken apart, humans in their ecosystems, right? Soils, farmers, people living in community in the broadest sense, right? And so a working hypothesis that comes out of this, right, is that if life comes back in the soil, if we're building soil health, right, does that bring the farmer back to life with the capital L? It's something we're starting to explore in different ways. And a sort of third working hypothesis we're working at question is, if we have healthier, more whole farmers, right, then do we have healthier communities as a result? We're starting to think about work on that question as well. Again, coming out of this research that emerged from research on, draining of the Ogallala Aquifer out in western Kansas and Nebraska. So, again, though, you probably know a lot of all this already, since a lot of the folks here have lived and worked this more directly than me. But that I hope it gives some insights. And again, I'm thankful to Allison and Audrey for the chance to share this research with you. And I look forward to answering your questions if you have them at this point.
I don't have a question, but I'm going to jump in, Matt. I just
Sure.
find it so interesting about the connection between death and the contrast between death and life and killing things as opposed to watching them grow. And I loved what you said about good farming is the way we see the world. And I never knew that it's actually a worldview to farm in a regenerative stance. And then the spring in their step. I love that piece. And so I love the research. I love what you shared. And like, I agree that a lot of the people on this call probably understand those principles, but the way you've gone about interviewing the farmers that have made the transition and are in a conventional context is very helpful for me. I'm not a farmer either, but I love them.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. That's very kind. Yeah, so we didn't expect to get into those kind of almost existential type conversations, but when you do spend time with folks that have been through this process and lived this process, this is where they take you ultimately.
So Matt, we do have a question in the chat.
Okay. Let me
What
see.
are the indicators associated with farmers who are willing to make the change to regenerative ag, and how do we quickly identify them?
Oh, that's a good question. So how do we know what farmers are willing to make the change? I don't know. I don't know how to identify these folks. Again, we tried to find people along a spectrum so that, we could understand folks that were farming more conventionally and farming sort of more full. I can tell you that those that are using fewer of the principles tend to be a little more risk averse, right? Tend to be a little more and there are good reasons for that, many of which, of course, are financial. the folks that they're also the second thing I would say, it's not going to be a satisfactory answer to Charles' very good question, because it is an open question. It's not one that I can answer directly with the research, but I can give you some, anecdotes. The second thing that factor perhaps is age. So we tend to define folks that if folks were younger and earlier in the transition, tended to be a little more likely to make the leap. But there was still some kind of financial reason that led to that break. Although I can tell you there were some folks that tended to be younger, and it wasn't about the financial motivation, it was the environmental factors. And they had young children, and they would bring that up. Like, I want my kids live with me on this farm, and this farm this is sort of paraphrasing, right? My kids live with me on this place, and this is a way of life, and I can't have this stuff, these pesticides, I can't have this around me. I can't have it around them. That tended to be a theme that I saw in the younger folks as well. So I would say risk aversion and age would be two key factors, but again, big caveats there is that I don't, that is not something I've looked at directly with the research. So it's more anecdotal evidence, but very good question.
I have a question for you. What social support networks or systems did you find that these farmers were able to tap into to find the spirit to move ahead as a part of their community instead of just being the Lone Ranger out there?
Yes, it's an excellent point. And so we know that no matter the phenomenon we look at, that people need groups of like-minded people around them to make change in their life. And that goes for farmers as well. So, I didn't get into it in this presentation, but folks that were more ostracized or put off by the typical yield banter at the coffee shop, they need to form their own groups, and they had to do it on their own outside of the traditional circles. So those were sort of pioneer types. That's a certain personality type that was willing to step out and do that. And then a couple of them became leaders in those conversations, and the changes start to radiate out. Now, we weren't there long enough to watch this whole process unfold, okay? But I'm confident that the folks that start those conversations and are in those conversations, those changes radiate out over time, and that leads to increase in adoption and uptake of these practices and principles. But you cannot, I shouldn't say cannot that strongly. It's very difficult to undertake the types of changes we're seeing on these farms by themselves. They need a community and a support network around them. I don't know exactly what that community looks like, what they're reading, who they're talking to. But I do know that these folks told us that routinely, that this was impossible by themselves. They had to have people to bounce ideas off of, tell them they weren't entirely crazy, these types of things. Yeah, that was a good question too.
We have another question in the chat. Thoughts on using the product of New World View after practicing Regen Ag to be used at the front end of transitioning to provide resilience or positive results to farmer? Is this a way to address the lag challenge?
If I understand correctly, I do think I do think it would be helpful. It depends on who we're talking about, but I think it would be helpful if, we're trying to build a community of practitioners, right, of people using these skills and these practices, that we talk to them about that, this is going to be holistic change. Like this is not something that you can dip your toes in it, but to talk to them more about the process we walk them that we observed, I think would be helpful. The realistic parts of this, right? That this thing is not going to be easy. that year 3 seems to be a key sticking point where we lose people, and that it's going to change you. And that may be okay. Because here's what it sounds like on the other side. But it is not going, I think it is good, to be honest about what these transitions look like. That it's not just going to be, you start these principles and practices, the soil responds quickly, and your finances turn around. It doesn't look like that. But going back to the very good question I just took, if there's a community of people around them, we know as social scientists, that makes a world of difference for getting people, for allowing people to stick with changes that are of this scale and scope. Okay. Is there a way to address the lag challenge? The community would be my answer to that. Have people around you that can support you, that have been through this. That would be my short answer and solicited advice. Yeah.
Question.
Yes, please.
Blue Dasher Farm is in the 3rd year of a 1,000 farm analysis of these very same principles that we've talked about. Jonathan Livingston and the Edisys Foundation have some tremendous developing inputs along the lines that you speak to. They're up in
Okay.
South Dakota. You would look them up. They have a field day every July or August. It's a tremendous opportunity to rub shoulders with similar thinking, challenged producers across many states. Fortunately, we were included last year in their analysis of what our farm was and wasn't. And it's a good indicator. It's a very expensive process, but because of the grants that they have, it costs the producer nothing. But it gives them a good, clear snapshot of where he's at in the process of his soils, the insects, the soil life, all of those things. So look into Jonathan Livingston. Blue Dasher is the farm. Edisys Foundation is where the funding comes from.
Thank you very much. I've taken that note. Thank you. I appreciate that, Mike.
Yeah, they're very bold. They use a lot of Kansas folks.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've heard, is that John Lundgren,
Yes.
who's the entomologist? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Doing good work, and it's scaling up.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We've been with them for 5 or 6 years on their summer show and tell, and it's gone from 50 to a couple hundred. And they have a long view. They're not in the short answer, and they realize that it's adaptation along the way.
Yeah. Very good. Appreciate that. And they found you, or you found them, or
a mutual admiration society.
okay.
Yeah.
Good. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah. Good to know.
So Matt, we have another strong question from Chuck Francis.
Sure.
Can sociologists help us identify leaders who are open to supporting change and who have motivations over and above the immediate bottom line?
That's a tall order.
That's lenders, not leaders.
Lenders, yeah.
Oh,
The
lenders, sorry.
and the lenders. And my short answer is no. I don't have, lender lists in my back pocket. I do know that is where the conversations are heading around how do these, that is, and it is a more provocative question, right? But I know that question is being asked in some research circles now. And as a sociologist, again, I appreciate and support those types of questions because, and contrary to what you just heard, which was a lot of emphasis on the individual farmer, we think it's important to understand the individual perspectives, right? But ultimately, what we're involved in here with regenerative ag and agriculture in general is a set of relationships, right? And so part of that web of relationships involves your bankers and your lenders. And we can't, but they have been, I would say, neglected as a source or influence over what's happening with the soil and the farming practices and principles. So it's an unsatisfactory answer, but it is a direction that we are heading in with the research to try to understand more about that relationship and how it can be modified, changed, helped to help these folks do what they want to do with their land. Yes.
To that end, there is a bank, Flanagan Bank, and they have one advocate within their facility that if you come in and want to start conventional, they'll lay out the whole cost for a 1, 3, and a 5 year. And then they'll do that on the organic side. And they will show you that in the first set, you're going to be red. If you do it in the organic side, you're going to be black. It is not perfect, but it is a light in the banking institutions that I've enjoyed knowing for probably 6 or 7 years. Flanagan Bank, I believe it's in Illinois, and they just do a bang up job of educating, and they do go on the circuits in the fall and winter, presenting that information on why you should take a look at regenerative ag, i.e. organic, is, I'm going to say, leaning towards that kind of a relationship. Excellent, factual based success stories is what they share.
Excellent. Very well, very good. Is there anything else I can? Yep.
We have a comment. Thank you for breaking down the traditional silos by melding ag science with the social sciences. It says, I have always told my students everything is connected.
Thank you. It's hard, but it's
yeah.
possible. It's possible.
And then Stephanie says there are some entities like Mad Agriculture. Yeah, we've worked with them before. Yeah, doing some innovative financing for farmers transitioning to regen. So
that outfit came up a couple times as well. And so I am aware of them, Mad Agriculture out in Boulder. I forget the name of the CEO, the president, but yeah, exactly. Doing some innovative work to raise money and change lending, work with lending practices as well. So yeah, Phil Taylor, exactly.
Yep, that's right.
I don't know that person personally, but that name came up a couple times. So the space is starting to change, but it's slow. Thank you, Stephanie.
So do we have any other questions? I think, Audrey, you wanted to mention a couple things before we wrap up?
You bet. But Matt, where did you find these farmers? How did you find folks that you knew were interested in regenerative ag and were actually taking steps in that?
Yeah, so we found a lot of different ways. So again, we tried to get diversity. So some of them, again, were from contacts that I had made with, all of them were from with contacts through farmers and ranchers that we had worked with in the field. And then we would find sort of pockets of people. Again, this speaks to the point again about community, because we would find one and then we'd say, who disagrees with you the most? And who agrees with you the most on these key, and then we'd go talk to both sets to the extent that they were willing to talk with us to try to get as much diversity as we could. So that turns out to be about 60% of the challenge of doing this work, is just to simply identify who's out there and try to get as much diversity as possible. But we work through, networks on the ground and then what we call snowball sample off of them. So we weren't looking to get generalizability from qualitative research, right? But we were trying to get saturation. So to where we ran out, we were hearing the same things over and over. Then we knew we had gotten to the point where we were onto a theme and there was something real there. And those were the things I talked about today, not the more speculative stuff. But we worked through networks and the ones that I had worked with before, and then it just kind of, like life, emerged, right? That's how it should work. So
exactly. Yeah, I did want to just take a second and tell you about some things that we're doing at Sustainable Ag on these points. If I could start hold on one second. Had this all ready to go, of course. Sorry. Well, anyway, I'll just start right here with this slide. So when I talked to Matt about this, and he talked about some of the farmers are so isolated, they're so by themselves working alone. And one of the programs we're doing through the TOPP initiative is called Grow Together Farmer Connect. And this is where we will go to different communities in person so farmers can get together and actually see a neighbor or a cousin or whatever, so that they have that community that they're looking for. And I think that that's a big part of it. Another thing, we do have a farm tour coming up on June 8th, and that's near Plymouth, Nebraska, and that is with Katie Jansen at West End Farm, and she's going to be talking about sustainable practices that she's done on her farm. And one other thing just wanted to share with you is that we have an organic excellence program, and this is where we're inviting people. If you've tried organic principles, if you've looked at sustainable practices, what have you learned? And the whole point of this is to share your story. Why did you try it? What did you find out? What are you going to do differently? And so those are things that we're looking at, not just because of talking to Matt, but in talking to Matt, we realize that there is a need for that community. And like you said, 60% of the challenge is finding the people. And so we definitely understand that. And if you know anyone that's interested in this program, any of our programs, they can contact me. Or right here is the, I put in the chat, that is how you can apply for that Organic Excellence Program, to tell some of the people what you've done and what you've learned. And I just want to say, Dr. Sanderson, I have to call you that because I just love this research. And I like that it's hopeful. I like that there's a way, like my dad is 89 and farming like he always has. And when he saw Dave Vetter's, the foundation field day, he was like, I would do it if I was younger. You know, so to get away from the yield and into the idea of healthy soil, I think is key. And I think we're on the uprise with that. So thank you, Dr. Sanderson.
Well, I appreciate again, Allison and you, Audrey, for inviting me. And yeah, I hope it was useful in some way. So thank you.
You're muted, Allison, and I see
I'm
your
so
note,
sorry.
Marjorie. You bet.
That's okay.
I say, I know we're over time a few minutes, so I want to respect people's time, and I know we've lost a few, so if people have to drop off, that's understandable. I want to respect your time, Matt, because I know you're at end of semester crunch. The recording will be available on our website, and I'm sure NSAS might want to put it on theirs as well. So as soon as the link is available and it's up, I will send that to the list of all the registrants so you all can access that. And we do have, I know, did we lose? Mike, you had your hand up. No, okay. And Chuck had one last comment. We have found in the Norwegian agroecology master's program that over 20 years, more students are concerned about the human dimension of change, and this needs to be a vital component of changes to more regenerative systems. So,
Wow. Nice.
right. And Marjorie said, I am a former organic farmer. Please include me. Okay. So we will get you added to our list. And once you get on, it's hard to get off, Marjorie. I'm just going to warn you. So I want to thank everybody again. Thank Matt, thank Audrey for working with us today. And again, you'll be hearing from me soon. Chuck, one more thing.
He's clapping.
Oh, clapping. Very good. Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Have a great afternoon.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Take care.
You too.